Battle of Hastings, October 14th, 1066. Dawn bleeding across Sussex's undulating hills, throwing a sinister light on the two armies that mirrored one another across the valley. Harold Godwinson's Anglo-Saxon feared, a powerful line of interlocking shields held by axe-wielding thanes, formed a bristling shield wall on one side. Their faces were a patchwork of tiredness and unyielding resolve, carved with grim determination. Only a few days before, they had wiped out a Viking raid in the north, headed by the tyrant Hardrada. Their diminished numbers served as a reminder of their recent triumph, as they now faced a potential defeat, yet remained unflinching. There was simmering tension of a gruesome kind across the valley. Wearing a flowing scarlet surcoat and sparkling mail, William the Duke of Normandy looked over his well-prepared army. The finest of Norman nobles and knights sat atop strong destriers, their gleaming armour glistening in the early morning light. A sea of crossbowmen and archers prepared their volleys behind them, their orderly columns a sharp contrast to the more disorganised Thane structure. With only the sound of the clang of armour and the warriors' mumbled prayers in both tongues, the air hummed with tense energy. Astute Commander William recognised the vulnerability of his position. Harold, a seasoned warrior with a devoted army, stood between England and the throne, but England remained essentially unbowed. The battlefield went silent when a lone individual appeared out of the Norman ranks. Eustace, the ferocious warrior and notoriously vicious Count of Boulogne, urged his horse along. With a sly smile twiddling his lips, he arrived at the middle of the valley and roared a challenge over the unclaimed territory. "Is there any Englishman amongst you who dares face a true knight?" A lone thane emerged from the English lines. With a flowing beard, the colour of wheat, Leofric, a huge guy, lifted his two-handed axe and screamed back, "There are many Englishmen here who dare face you." The crowd roared in approval. The warriors yearned for this kind of close-knit combat, a taste of victory before the full-blown clash. With his lance levelled like a lethal jousting pole, Eustace charged. Leofric repelled the blow and held his ground, his axe a blur. With a loud snap, the lance broke and Eustace was knocked off balance, barely staying in his seat. When Leofric made a powerful arc with his axe, the crowd held its breath. Desperate, Eustace lifted his shield, but the blow's force tore through the unfortunate Count's arm and broke the wood. Eustace let out an agonised cry and collapsed off his horse, leaving a red smear on his breastplate. With the English army's thunderous roar trembling the hill's very foundations, Leofric lifted his axe in triumph. This one-of-a-kind skirmish was a harbinger of the impending storm. Crossbow bolts and arrows fell in a hail upon the English shield wall. The sound of impact and the agonised screams of the injured formed a gloomy symphony, a foreshadowing of the impending bloodshed. Yet, the Thanes held firm, their shields a formidable barrier that deflected most of the missiles. Singing a loud battle cry, Taillefer, a well-known Norman warrior and minstrel, urged his horse forward. He cut through the arrow shower, a ray of hope amid the falling dead. When he reached the English lines, he charged at the enemy with such reckless abandon that he fell upon two thanes before a flurry of axes struck him, sending him sprawling to the ground in a tangle of flesh and blood. Taillefer's sacrifice gave the Norman knights more courage, and they charged. Snorting horses and a thundering mass of armoured warriors, they crashed into the English shield wall. When the two forces connected in a horrible crunch of steel and bone, the ground shook beneath their hooves. The young Norman knight Sir Guy charged at the head of the English line, driven by ambition and a craving for fame. He saw himself piercing the shield wall and wreaking havoc on his way to triumph. But when his lance encountered the unwavering shield of a grizzled thane named Wulfgar, his dreams were dashed. Guy was thrown backward by the force of the crash, his vision going black. Guy was about to lose his sense of direction when Wulfgar's axe lowered itself and split his skull in half, slicing through his helmet. The initial impact was a vicious dance of demise. Clad in armour that was almost indestructible, the Norman knights crashed against the shield wall. Men were flung off their feet and trampled under the oncoming horses' hooves, causing the earth to give way. Man and horse were reduced to a mess of limbs and steel as the thanes, brandishing their axes with fierce resolve, chopped at the knights' legs. Harold's booming voice served as a rallying cry as he relentlessly marched up the line, leading the way among the carnage. He saw a Norman knight riding a black stallion and brandishing a huge two-handed sword, who appeared to be very vicious. This was Robert de Tosny, a brutal and formidable fighter. Harold recognized him from previous battles, the icy determination in his eyes briefly replaced by a glint of hate. "De Tosny!" Harold let up a shout that pierced the din of combat. "You Norman canine! What you did in the north will cost you money!" De Tosny scoffed at the challenge, his face hidden under a barred headpiece. He shot back, "Harold Godwinson," his tone brimming with contempt. "The allotted time has expired. Duke William is the legitimate King of England." De Tosny let out a loud cry and propelled his horse ahead, guiding a group of Norman knights in the direction of Harold's location. Harold took the charge head-on, the lethal melody of his own battle axe resonating through the atmosphere. De Tosny's enormous sword struck him, but he parried it, feeling the shock ripple through his arms. With their swords gleaming in the early morning light, the two fighters engaged in a vicious dance of death. The war raged around them, unrelenting in its intensity. The English thanes battled with the desperation of cornered wolves, their early fatigue forgotten in the heat of battle. With their axes finding purchase on exposed flesh and weak areas in the armour, they chopped and slashed at the armoured knights. However, the Norman knights gradually started to get the upper hand, thanks to their better gear and training. Though less successful against the strong shield wall, their mounted charges were proving disastrous on the flanks, where the thanes lacked organisation. One such charge struck the English right flank, led by a formidable Norman knight. With a single strike, this massive man with a thunderous voice could smash through shields and tear armour. Taken by surprise, the flanking thanes were dispersed like leaves in a hurricane. A young man, who was just out of his teens, unexpectedly found himself in front of this fearsome warrior. Though fear was about to overwhelm him, the image of his allies collapsing around him strengthened his determination. He lifted his shield, preparing for the blow. He was knocked to the ground when the Norman warhammer struck his shield with tremendous force. A sharp pain shot through his arm, very certainly breaking the bones. However, before the Norman could strike the final blow, a group of English archers who were hiding on a nearby mound unleashed a barrage of arrows. A single arrow found its mark, penetrating Norman's armour and becoming lodged in his chest. The Norman let out a painful and surprised roar, letting go of his warhammer. The young man, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and vengeance, seized the opportunity. He stumbled to his feet and then stabbed the Norman in the exposed leg with his dagger. The enormous warrior collapsed to the ground, leaving a red stain on the earth from his lifeblood. Although the English gained a momentary advantage with the Normans' fall, the chaos soon grew more intense. When the Norman knights saw that the English flanks were vulnerable, they increased their efforts. Taking advantage of the openings in the shield wall, they caused panic within the English formation by having their horses trample over fallen thanes. Seeing his line break apart, Harold realised a desperate bet was required. A small group of his elite housecarls, fully armoured soldiers sworn to his personal security, gathered around him as he yelled an order, his voice hoarse from shouting. Harold gave a booming cry of battle and spearheaded a charge into the centre of the Norman soldiers to breach their defences and get to William. In a torrent of steel and rage, the housecarls tore a gory trail through the Norman ranks. Their axes sliced through flesh and armour as they brought down knights. With the might of a berserker, Harold killed multiple Norman nobility by hand, his fury a sight to behold on the battlefield. However, their heroic charge was ultimately in vain. They were besieged by the far larger Norman army. One by one, Harold's housecarls collapsed around him, their bodies piled high as a sign of their unwavering devotion. with the fierceness of a lion trapped in its dents. Harold himself battled on, his armour bloody and cracked. William felt a knot of worry tighten in his stomach as he saw the fighting from a neighbouring hill. Though beaten, the English shield wall held for the most part. Harold was causing chaos among his knights, a veritable tornado of ruin. William was aware that he had to take decisive action or else he would lose the war. Riding his horse hard, he mustered the last of his reserves, a new group of knights willing to stand their ground. "In favour of Normandy! For triumph!" he bellowed, his voice resonating throughout the battleground. With a new wave crashing into the already worn-out English line, the knights thundered forward. William was leading the attack when Harold found him, surrounded by the fallen bodies of his housecarls. He felt a wave of anger and defiance pass through him. He let out a savage cry and threw himself at the Duke, intending to finish the fight with a single devastating blow. The altercation between the two commanders mirrored the greater conflict in miniature. William, a formidable swordsman, but not very strong physically, deftly deflected Harold's opening blow. Fuming with wrath, Harold pressed the attack, his axe moving in a whirl. The two fighters struck each other, their armour clattering as they did so. The battle that surrounded them blurred. Ignorant of the commander's duel, English thanes and Norman knights engaged in a furious struggle. Blood gushed forth, turning the once green grass scarlet. The sound of clashing steel and the screams of the dying were accompanied by the ominous stench of death that pervaded the air. A wayward arrow struck Harold just as he was about to administer a last desperate blow, his strength failing from the long day's exertions. It entered Harold's eye socket through the opening between his mail and helmet. Harold screamed, choked, his axe slipping from his grasp. William took the chance and lunged forward with his sword. The knife struck its target and embedded itself firmly in Harold's chest. The English king fell to the ground, looking shocked and incredulous. The news of Harold's passing quickly went viral among the English people. Already buckled beneath the constant Norman onslaught, the shield wall started to fall apart. The thanes, devoid of a leader and discouraged, persevered with the fearless bravery of entrapped creatures. However, their opposition was fleeting. Boosted by Harold's death, the Norman knights mounted one last fierce attack. Where they stood, the surviving English soldiers were killed. The shield wall, which was formerly impenetrable, was completely destroyed, indicating how fierce the battle was. The Hastings battlefield was transformed into a macabre scene of death by dusk. The bodies of slain warriors scattered the once verdant hills, turning them crimson. The smell of burning flesh and blood filled the air, a somber reminder of the day's devastation. William finally allowed himself a tired smile as he surveyed the battlefield from his horse, his face showing a mix of relief and tiredness. The Battle of Hastings was won. Following centuries of Anglo-Saxon domination, England was now rightfully his. However, a moment of discomfort flashed through his consciousness as he took in the immense emptiness of the dead. He was aware that his triumph had cost him dearly. Even though it had broken, the English resistance was far from over. He recognized that the conquest of England was not over yet. But in the middle of all the gore and carnage stood the future English monarch. In the wreckage of his history, the Duke of Normandy was no longer a duke. England was under his control. He was the king, and he conquered England.